welcome everyone. Happy Aloha Friday to our Data Science Fellows meeting. It's really great to see so many of you here and also online. Today we're having a seminar. Dr. Kamuela Enos is here with us, the director of the Office of Indigenous Innovation, and he is going to talk with us about frameworks for using ancestral practices as a basis for contemporary innovation. Let me give you a little bit of his background. As I said, he's the director of the Office of Indigenous Innovation, and this is in the office of the vice president for research, and just started a year ago.
2 years now.
2 years? 2 years now. So
Teething.
newcomers to the scene, and I think a really exciting new addition to the UH system. He was born and raised in Wai'anae and comes from a family of cultural practitioners and farmers committed to using ancestral frameworks as the basis for contemporary restorative socio-ecological work. He has an undergraduate degree in Hawaiian Studies and an MA in Urban and Regional Planning from the University of Hawaiʻi at Mānoa. And he previously served as the Director of Social Enterprise at Mānoa Farms and was also a commissioner on President Obama's White House Initiative on Asian American and Pacific Islanders. What a treat to have you here, Kamu. Floor is yours.
Mahalo kako. Can everyone hear me? Then we do like the communion. I'm going to open this space just to ground us. Nakino malu talani malue ho na ho la kai kunako o makunu o makunu o makunu. Mama one. So mahalo everybody. Thank you for letting me share. First and foremost, I consider all of you experts in your own thing, in your own practice. So I never want to come across as being didactic or speaking at you. My hope today is to just share some of the things that I have been trained in and taught, and some of the intentions of what the things that have been invested in me can mean to the spaces we're in now. We're going to talk about indigenous practices, the seat of contemporary innovation, which in of itself is a complex and potentially controversial issue. So it is also a conversation that you can't have out of context. So I have a presentation, but I also got movie time. So I have 2 videos to take a little bit of time, but they're really important to me. The first video is a video of these 2 these 2 elders that I'll share about later in my presentation, but that my father and his peers, and I'm a child of activist family members, that in the 80s, they brought these 2 elders to our community of Wai'anae to restore opelu fishery, and opelu is a mackerel fishery. So they filmed them going out on their boats and catching fish, and the whole process of how they not just caught it, but they managed the fishery offshore. And the second video I want to show is a video of the organization that I recently left, Mānoa Organic Farms, and our basic premise and how we use principles like our ancestors taught us to create a contemporary space, not just for innovation's sake, but innovation to restore agency to communities that have been marginalized, and how that is rooted in science, in the observed sciences. So I'm going to show the first video. It's about 8 minutes, and these 2 uncles is Uncle Eddie, Uncle Walter Paulo, and Uncle Eddie Ka'anana. And watch it and think about the sciences involved in what they're doing.
ke kuno oi. Tane he mole ka ke ia mea. Malamai mea upaka. Makanian makauno.
Ay no ka opel man. Ilo yak.
Makoa mamua te ia ke helu ana ka opelu ke kau. Ewalu. Ewa. Ya kulo kau.
Cow here now. There's 3 cow. It's 120 fish. Yeah, in the past they used to count by the 40s. That's 1 cow. 10 count 4 fish at a time. 10 times is 40. So the count is always by the cow. 40 fish. Anything's 40. They count by 40. 40 fathoms, 40 sticks, whatever. And they will place 1 opelu to identify the 40. 1 cow. Yeah, we got 5 cow, which is 200. How many? 5 cow and 16 fish. Oh yeah. It's a small catch. The current was going Kalailoa directions. Generally, the current go to Kaena would be more favorable. But today, since around 9 o'clock, he was moving towards Kalailoa. We like to fish when the current's in favor, you know, going in the right direction. So we'll try again next time.
What you do with the counters?
The counters, during the olden days, We used to sell 75 cents for one ka'au. This size would be 50 cents one ka'au. And the counter would go to the buyer. In other words, if he buys 20 ka'au, he gets 20 extra fish. But this size here, what is known as medium size, runs around 50 cents for 40 fish. Pretty expensive, huh? Today it runs, you go down to the supermarket, it's about $4 a pound. So fisherman gets about $1.50, $1.75. Almost count by fours, yeah. That's our whole kupu to these guys down here. They're mama or kanupu. Yeah, Corona. That's the whole kupu for today.
I never even going to water already.
Ini me mako. Kaya mamua. Ko mako hana ga e miloli. Ai no kot. Wai. Open. Ke mako itu wai open. Ko mako wali ini. Ai o makai. Ai mako itu kai lawai ani.
And your love that has gone away will come back to me.
First video. And I think the important thing to note about this video was that there's a meta to it. These uncles were in our community to fish specifically because the community organization that my father was a part of were actively trying to create alternatives to tourism, the types of development that they didn't want to see have happen in the community. But they were also wrestling, well, how do we create jobs using our practices? So they fundraised for the canoe, and they also created programming to teach young men in our community of Wai'anae to do pellet fishing. And I'm actually really lucky that I was able to be I was getting emotional at that video, but I was able to be raised by this. But it's good. I think these are like really happy memories, and they kind of are the basis though of why I'm showing up at the university to talk about, like, I hope you can understand, and I'll talk about it in my video, my presentation, that they are scientists. And they're also economists, because the fisheries they managed were part of a non-monetary economy that allowed people to live in space indefinitely. And at that time, they were called backward Hawaiians and like savages. And why don't you get rid of all of these things and use this lands for resorts and these other types of things and destroy the fisheries. So I'm sorry I get emotional. I mean, I'm not sorry I get emotional. I get emotional because they're dear to me as uncles. The other video I want to show is about a contemporary organization, Mānoa Farms, that is part of this lineage of practice that I come from in Wai'anae. And we're using our systems to build our practices as a seat to build our interventions of how we want to empower our community. This video was done by Al Jazeera. AJ Plus is about 6 years old now. But this is on Ma'o farms. I have a cameo for situational awareness.
In Hawaii, Native students are dropping out at an alarming rate. Only 4 out of 5 finish high school, and only 2 of those will earn a college degree. And in Wai'anae, Hawaii, the problem is even worse. This coast has the highest concentration of indigenous Hawaiians. It is also one of the poorest regions in the state. Only 14% of the people here hold a college degree. But one farm is working to solve this education crisis by combining modern agriculture and ancestral Hawaiian practices. Mānoa Farms in Wai'anae, Hawaii pays for Native youth to go to college and teaches them how to run it based on indigenous principles. Sana, also known as Kawi, manages Mānoa Organic Farms. 10 years ago, she participated in their internship program. Today, she's leading it.
Every morning before we start the day here at Mānoa, we come together in a big circle and we do a oli. Ehomai is a chant that we do to ground ourselves, to start the day pono or in balance. The work that we do is sacred. It's probably about 5:15-ish right now at the farm. We're harvesting curly kale for our order today. Maybe close to 200 pounds of this today, which is actually kind of a small order for us. Most of this kale will be going to restaurants here on Oahu. When I graduated high school, I was just this quiet little thing. I couldn't even have eye contact with anybody at the farm. As I got connected more with the farm, and then I got to taste food, I got to see food grow, I got to feed my family, I got to feed others in the community. I really started to feel like I was a part of something beyond me.
In Wai'anae, college tuition remains unaffordable for many. But at Mānoa Farms, young people can work the land in exchange for college scholarships and a monthly stipend.
This is our sassy salad mix. Salad with a kick, salad with some spice, salad with some attitude.
Cherise has lived in Wai'anae her whole life.
Growing up, I always felt really lucky because I always got to go to the beach every day. I got to see these beautiful mountains. As I got older, I started to hear all these stereotypes about my community, and that kind of just segued that it was directly about me. When I got accepted into UH Mānoa, I didn't have the money for it. I didn't want to get into debt, and I didn't want to ask my parents for money because I'm the oldest of 7. And one of my teachers recommended me to do this program. I found the family that I never knew I needed.
Mānoa paid her tuition and allowed her to get a degree in Hawaiian Studies.
When I first came to the farm, I never thought I would ever be a farmer. I just wanted to use this as a platform for me to get my degree, and which I did, and I ended up falling in love with farming and working with land and with food. And it's the same thing with some of these guys.
When I heard about Mānoa and the things they do, it connected more to what I wanted to do as a person. Getting up at 5 a.m. is kind of rough for me, but then I just think of when you can actually hear nature and then you see the sunrise and everything. It's a good start for my day, actually.
They're probably not going to be farmers, but if these guys end up becoming doctors or social workers or teachers in our community, I think it's super critical for them now that they're in their program. They can bring these values to their workspace and to their families.
My passion is working on the land. It's very challenging to balance school and work, but the best way to better yourself is to get out that comfort zone. And I think it's a perfect opportunity for me to do that.
One of our biggest philosophy here is to harvest the same day that it's delivered. So everything you see here is harvested this morning.
Young people in Wai'anae face high levels of drug addiction, domestic violence, and a lack of access to healthy food. But not here on the farm. Hokulani Kepo O'Florence plans to continue farming here for at least her 4 years of college.
I became a mom at 20 years old. They're always telling me, Hoku, you're doing awesome. It's just those words, like I kind of go back home to my son feeling good.
Monday thought went really good with the outside crew. We're gonna try to do more planting today, so just be ready. No panic, we're organic.
Charisse and her colleagues at Mānoa Farms believe that reconnecting with the lifeways of their ancestors is essential to the development of young leaders. 85% of their student cohort is Indigenous Hawaiian.
In ancient Hawaiian times, land stewardship meant to take care of the land from the mountain to the ocean. You only take what you need.
And when you take care of the land takes care of you. It totally starts to change the dynamic of how we connect with food and with each other.
There are a whole bunch of other people doing good jobs, but I'm going to try to make...
Kamuela Enos joined the farm over 10 years ago. He leads the social enterprise of Mānoa Farms, integrating the twin pillars of modern economics with traditional relationship with the land.
I'm actually really interested in the idea of indigenizing. And indigenizing is, to me, means that you look at the structures that were thrust upon you, whether it's economic, social, whatnot, and how do you repurpose these structures to be vehicles for ancestral responsibilities. So it means that you have to have dual fluencies. You have to have a fluency in your ancestry and a fluency in contemporary spaces. We're not just providing empowerment, like we have bottom lines we have to hit on a daily basis. To take that kind of risk with them was a huge gamble. One of the first interns we took it with was Kaui. At 27, Kaui is an elder already.
Mānoa Farms has grown into the largest organic farm on the island of Oahu, and over 300 students have participated in their internship program. Every Saturday morning, Charisse and her students travel to Honolulu to sell their vegetables at a local farmer's market and engage with the larger community.
So you can just measure them out like by your hand, like a nice big bunch, because we only sell these for $1 anyway. 2 limes for $1. Curly kale on sale. The knowledges and the practices that people are calling new and sustainable, it's not new, yo. It's new with the silent K. Like, we've known this. Our ancestors known this. I just want to continue do more for, the people of Wai'anae and evidently the world, because we are all connected.
Okay. Movie time's done. I wanted to, provide the context. So when I talk about these things, there's a visual representation. I'm not talking about abstractions. So I'm going to jump into my presentation because I want to stay on time. Thank you. So the general, there you go. The general premise of this presentation, as I started, is to us, you cannot talk about innovation unless you're talking about restoration. And one of my mentors, Auntie Puanani Burgess, who's an incredible leader, when I told her I was creating an Office of Indigenous Innovation, if you ever met her, she's just a very, she's like the personification of some elemental force of peace, but thoughtfulness. And like, she looks right through you quite often. She asked me, where does the word dignity live along the word innovation for communities like ours? Like, how do we innovate in a dignified way? And I took that to heart. So before I begin, in all things, when we speak of innovation as restoration, we have to talk about genealogies. So my genealogy of thought comes from this valley. My father, who I'll share in the next slide, Eric Enos, and a bunch of his peers in the late 70s and early 80s occupied land in the back of Wai'anae Valley and brought water back down to traditional agrarian systems called lo'ikalo that had been sitting fallow when the government removed water from traditional practice to feed sugar plantations down in the next valley over. And they occupied land and they cleared the space out and they brought water back and they began to regrow what we call it. So this is my first kumu. My first mentor is this land here and valley. And then these men, as you saw, is Uncle Eddie, Uncle Walter. That's my dad when he was younger than me in a video. I can share a link to. And there's a very grumpy me when I was probably like in 5th grade being filmed. It's really cool to be Hawaiian now. Hawaiian identity is really awesome back then. It was like, must have been 83. It was like, I wasn't trying to tell everybody that I was going to, I was really pissed that they were filming me do it, as you can see in my face. But this is like, I'm the eldest grandchild of my family, so I really carry a lot of that with me. And these are also the mentors that I want to bring to the space. In the top right left is Uncle William Ila Sr. He's from Wai'anae. To the right is Kukui Mauna Kea, the founder of Ma'o Farms with her husband Gary. And in the bottom, Derek and Kaui, my two mentors who taught me how to understand what my role is in providing a space for the next generation to pick up the mantle of work that was handed to me. So that's kind of who helped me do this work. So this idea I wanted to share is 4 steps of a practice that I've developed over time in consultation with others, but I really at the seat of what I'm doing now, of how can we reposition restoration as innovation. And the first step of this process is to restate our value. And what I found was really important when I was up in the taro farms and I was a kid being voluntold to weed eat. I also went to our public schools. So I dropped out of the DOE high school down the street. I dropped out of Wai'anae High School. So how many of you are from Wai'anae? I'm from Oahu, Hawaii. Yeah. So I'm a Wai'anae High School dropout. So that means something. You know what Wai'anae is. And when I was being raised in the valley with my father and these elders like Uncle Walter and Uncle Eddie, and just seeing our systems, what they were telling me about the value of our ancestry was absolutely not jiving what they were saying we were in Wai'anae High School. And it really pissed me off. I was like, it started this whole like, well, what are we gonna do about it, right? Because getting mad is just the first step. And what I realized was that later on in life, I went to college, I got my bachelor's in Hawaiian Studies and my master's in urban and regional planning, all at UH all the way. I learned Hawaiian language. When I was learning Hawaiian language, I began to recognize we were choosing the wrong words in English to describe our ancestral practices. Yeah, and like, I think Hawaiian culture is an important word, but when I started to think about like, Hawaiian is not our word, that our ancestors didn't call themselves Hawaiians. They had a different terminology to describe themselves. And the word culture I found was really interesting. Culture is like the word freedom. It's highly emotional and very poorly defined. And you can run a lot of bullshit through the word freedom, as we've seen. So the mentors I had always asked me to be specific about what I was saying. So I started thinking about, well, if I could choose the right words in English that in my experience, could describe what I saw, and after getting a graduate degree, I said, I think I would like to call in English, say what our ancestors did, ancestral sciences and technologies of integrated biosystems management, and then have them prove us wrong. But I think the important part of that is understanding pre-contact context. To me, ancestral sciences are sciences of a different order. You can't casually use words between languages, because I believe words, the land teaches you language. The land teaches you the language you need to survive it. And in our pre-contact system, I look at contemporary sciences and the way I've been, how it functions was really what does it optimize for? The optimization point. And quite often, how contemporary sciences are used in society is to optimize for ownership and extraction. And it's not necessarily a bad thing per se. We create cool things like our laptop and iPhone. There's things that come from that space, but it is a point of differentiation ancestral sciences optimize for regeneration and calibration. And what is the seat of the difference between the two societies we exist in? Our ancestral society had a non-monetary economy. We didn't take fish, store them and dry them and cut a piece of kapa and say trade at them. Wealth wasn't an abstraction like it is now. There are practitioners of true wealth. In pre-contact society, your ecology was your economy. In the valley that we lived, the two uncles, Uncle Eddie and Uncle Walter, they were managing an endowment. They looked at that school of fish as their principal. They knew what the interest was relative to who had to eat up in the valley. They were managing the lean proteins of society. And up in the valley, the taro farm was managing the complex carbs. And how the waterway worked as the water passed through the lo'i and it entered into the ocean. The growing of kalo created the nutrients that fed the nearshore estuary. And the whole system was a closed loop one. Ideally, as far as I can remember from my Hawaiian studies back in 2004, I may have updated a bit, but you were self-sufficient in your own valley, completely. The arena right now in Mānoa, everything we lived off of would have come from this valley, and you did it in a way that you could pass that on to the next generation. Like you would never extract everything and sell it on the market to get coinage back. You managed your entire system as an endowment. So I do think those two uncles were deep ocean scientists and understanding of pelagic species, as well as economists of the highest order. And the genealogy of people was entwined, the genetics of people were entwined with the genetics of the fish and was entwined to the genetics of the cow. They were descendants alongside each other. They managed the whole system as a family. So that's how deep the science of ancestry was here. And then at the family unit, if that was the structure of state, the family unit, the family unit was the unit by which things happened in pre-contact society. You couldn't separate who is your family member from who is your teacher, from who is your spiritual leader, from who is your doctor. They were all the same people. You didn't bifurcate them into different places. You didn't go to school there, work there, church there. You did it all in the same space. And moreover, the land itself was your family. In contemporary ancestral sciences, if we were to use contemporary nomenclature, would have been considered biocentric versus anthropocentric. We did not see land as the dominion that we could use. Actually, in a pre-contact cosmology, humans are understood to be the youngest sibling on a sentient and ancestral landscape. And I give this presentation before, and I like this part. Like, I don't know how it is in other cultures, but in Polynesian culture, the youngest have one job. It's STFU and listen. But in that listening, you're protected. In that listening, you're cared for. And it makes sense because to me, when is the last time you taught a mountain something? Or the ocean something, right? It's your teacher. It's the basis of your human genealogical, like your human teachers were taught by this landscape. So we served it in that way. What's important to note is that when we lost this relationship, when we're severed from this practice, this became the seat of ecological and social degradation in our communities. Is when Hawaiians, as myself, began to understand ourselves as poor. We were moved from working in ahupua'as and moved into homesteads and other spaces. And we also began to see the beginning of ecological degradation. So the challenge is like, well, then you see people as poor and you see the landscape as degraded. Let's fix them in silos. And what we're trying to position is you can't. You can't fix poverty. You can't fix ecological degradation outside of themselves. What we are trying to position is the restoration of these systems is the intervention with the communities of practice in a really inclusive way. That is like us versus them, but it needs to be at the seat of how we think about it. The second step is to reframe our work. So as I mentioned, the idea of indigenization was really key to me. Is like, how do we start with decolonization? And I've studied that a lot in college of like understanding these systems that were thrust upon us and how do we decenter it? Because it doesn't fit our island realities. How do we think about what it means to actually live into ancestral practices? But the other part is critical. It's like I watched my father then remove invasive plants from the lo'i, but then you had to plant stuff in it. And that's where there's an opportunity to indigenize, is to bring these, to use your practices as a space to use your practices in contemporary spaces. So to think about that, there's a process that came up, which is the triple pico analysis. Really quickly, one of our beloved Hawaiian mentors, who was Uncle Kekuni Blaisdell, who's a Hawaiian physician, and he would talk to us a lot about pico. And pico is a Polynesian Hawaiian concept. You have three pico. You have your fontanelle, which is your pico o, your pico po'o. And he taught that this was the connection point to the spirit realm. This was a connection point to people who love you, but are no longer physically here. Like your ancestry, like your intuition, like this is a space that they exist. The second pico is your navel, or your pico vaina, or your pico e. And that's the connection you have to everyone who's alive with you right now. Those who share the space of the living. And your third pico is your pico ma'i, or your pico a, which is your reproductive organs. And that's your connection to future generations. So decision making was always along this transect. It was like canoe sailing. Where were you? Where are you now? And where are you going? All decisions are made along that impact, like that line of thinking. So an indigenization process for me, the first part of it is to say, if you're going to indigenize something, don't just say Hawaiian culture. Say, what specific ancestral practice are you going to bring into a contemporary space? How is it done? Like, did you do literature review? Did you physically do it? And do you have a kumu? Is there a genealogy? Like all business plans that are indigenized have a genealogy attached to it. You can't just take the knowledge and run with it. You have to show that someone taught you and they consent to your using this practice and sharing it with others. But the third part of the analysis, I think is really important, is that what is your aha moment? It's like, what is that moment you're like, wait, this isn't just something that's meaningful to the past. This is meaningful right now. That's something that you can get excited about, right? So that's the first layer. The second layer of analysis is the pico-e, is how is that bringing of ancestral practice to a contemporary space, providing executive decision-making potential to the community of origin. Like how are we using these practices to allow the communities that have been marginalized to reclaim agency and decision-making in their own home? That this is helping them not just better their lives, but take control of the resources that they once managed for the betterment of all. And then the third pico that we think about is how is this contemporary restoration of agency providing a platform for future generations' right to abundance. And I think for this F score, it's really critical because it is focused on climate data. It is focused on these existential issues that humans created, a certain mindset of humanity created. How are we facing those things down with the sense that we will provide abundance regardless? The next step for me is to then re-enter into contemporary practices. So I'm going to, how do we take this and create business plans and write grants and do that work? And I'm going to use the Ma'o example really quickly. So at Ma'o Farms, you know, we're Hawaiians, but we're growing kale and chard. People are like, are you growing? Is this like Hawaiian food? Like there was this really interesting kind of conundrum because we weren't growing taro, and we're growing Western things. So we had to sit down to think about it. So that's kind of where I came up with triple pico analysis. So I thought of Ka'ala farms that I shared as like the pico, like this is the basis for where we're pulling to create a contemporary variant from. And the first challenge you have is that our ancestors were not farmers. So when you say farmer, it's like, I've learned this thing like implicit bias, or when you say farmer, you have an image that comes up, right? Yeah, Farmer Brown probably, and there's like a tractor and a pig and a dale and stuff like that. What Farmer Brown did was farm things and take his product to market to sell for cash for goods and services. People who farmed in pre-contact society managed water. They were managing a waterway and growing kalo through that waterway, like taro, and also managing just like the health of society by making sure that they had access to just key part of their diet. And they're also managing the body form of a deified ancestor called Haloa, which is considered at first the progenitor of human. So they were not farmers. So we had to understand, like, well, what were they? They were systems managers. They managed the health and welfare of the whole space through water and caring for people and their spiritual health, as well as their crop. They also existed in a non-monetary economy. So what were the metrics of state to use to judge the efficacy of their work? Right now, we're heading into the season of makahiki, which ancestral times, the chief would come to each valley that he or she or they were responsible for caring for. And during this time of year, the people of the land would bring out crops to show how much they could produce, and they would show how fit they were spiritually, physically, mentally. There are all these feats of abundance and strength. Now, if you live in Hawaii, the makahiki is kind of seen as a quaint festival. But as we understood it, that was a year-end reporting to your chief. And the metrics they looked at, how fit are the people, how abundant is the landscape, and how healthy is your water. Those are the measures of society. And that's when you could actually get your contract renewed. You could do business like you do. Here's your projected, here's your actuals, here's your variance. Did we do what we said we would do? And they were measuring the right things society should be measuring, because a GDP does not tell you how well the place is actually working. It tells you how the wealthiest segments of it are keeping their ass alive, but it does not tell you how the rest of society is living. So in that case, this was how we broke down Ma'o. Well, we tracked on a daily basis in Ma'o to this process with sales of product and GPAs of students. So the sales of product, the GPAs of students was how we correlated health. And it's not the perfect indicator of health of people, but for young adults in a marginalized community, and the emphasis of this internship was to create leaders, a college degree provided you access to decision-making. It allowed you to enter into a workforce and not just be someone's wage slave, but actually have the ability to make decisions with that degree and also feed your family. On the abundance of landscape, we looked at sales from organic farming. And we didn't look at organic farming because we loved organic farming per se, but it was the closest model of farming in contemporary society that aligned with ancestral farming because it focuses on soil. Ancestral practice focused on soil, not crop. It was managing the soil as an endowment that I looked at, and organic principles force you to have to actually manage soil. It doesn't put your emphasis on yield over the health of soil. So we found these two correlatives to hit. And when we hit sales and GPAs, we went from being angry voices as easy to marginalize to job creators and degree designers, and that dignity of being in this space is co-designing for a community versus being relegated to tell people stop. We don't want this in our community. And that's the basic premise. And the other part that's really critical in this process is that we had to find our ancestral measures so we don't, in becoming successful society, make ourselves complicit. There's no point in being the new them. I have cousins and friends that had to end up in like eating drugs at a point in their life because of the realities. Did they like it? Hell no. But it was the only way that they saw at that window of life that they could make a living, because they super didn't want to be working in construction or other places. But it made them successful in contemporary society at the expense of their community. So we looked at those things deeply, like how do we not do that? And this was one of the ways we thought about it. Another way that we use our ancestral practices in contemporary systems is looking at how we recruited. So when I started, I was responsible for recruiting young adults from Wai'anae High School and Nanakuli High School to go to college. And I began to see all of the silos that were there in their recruitment. Like a young adult wondering what to do with their life, no one in their family in college, they have no context for it. Funders and governments wanting to support scholarships or putting these lofty goals out there every year, but how you hit it, I don't know. I want to go to Mars too, but you got to have some roadmap to do it. But anyway, colleges and high schools being mandated to either graduate young adults from our community or recruit them and retain them in universities, and not knowing what's the mechanism. And social entrepreneur, like business looking for labor. They're all sitting in silos wondering, and I realized our organization provided an intervention, an opportunity. It was based off of the waterways our ancestors used in the valley. So the Owai was the flow of water that went from the Po'owai, the headwater, passed through all of our farms, entered into the estuary that fed our fish ponds. And it was the responsibility of the community to make sure the most precious asset was woven through the valley. We repositioned our youth as water. And we identified what will be a pathway to get them from 10th grade to employment. And getting all of these people to work together in aggregated, like identifying what their needs were. Like, hey, we want to help. We know you need to graduate kids from high school. We have a means to do so. We know you need to recruit kids to college. We have a means to do so. We help you hit your outcomes. But this is what we need. We need to have time on campus. We need to create college degrees and kind of showing how we can win together. But we're all coming together because we all agree that the youth are super important. And how do we make sure that they have an experience that will start them up at high school, get them to college workforce, but return them back to their community. And they become the most precious and sacred things we care for. And the last part I will put, and I think I'm running, right now. The last part of the framework is to reestablish our agency. And talk is cheap. So here are some of the metrics that using this model has allowed. So this is 2 years old, 4 years old. So our program was able to graduate 108 students with their associates, 25 with their bachelor's, and 3 with their master's. This is all from Wai'anae. This is actually growing a lot more, but this was showing what we could do with that. And that matters not just to people at Wai'anae. That matters to policymakers, that matters to funders, that matters to the second, like so another example, what comes out of this. When I was at university, when I was at Mānoa, we were able to partner with the researcher here, Dr. Liko Maunakea, and he did a study on interns at our farm. He studied the gut microbiome and found that young adults on our farm were 50 to 60% less likely to develop type 2 diabetes, saving the state $15,000 a year. We leveraged this model to create, when I worked in an organization like the Purple Maya Foundation, which is an indigenous-led tech startup space, to do things like pairing indigenous researchers like Dr. Kiana Frank with folks in the tech sector. And this was a project that we did, it was a competition to kind of take these melded ideas of indigenous, ancestral, and contemporary technologies to build things out, which was a jury prize. And this was when they had worked with to create facial recognition software on cameras at the entry points of Mānoa fish ponds to kind of like create these. They're really innovative, but stuff that doesn't put the practitioner out of work, but helps them deepen their practice to observe kinds of principles. We were able to create a college degree, a bachelor's of applied science and sustainable clean food systems. And I think another example of like deploying these principles, I have a peer who has a taro farm in the middle of Pearl Shopping Center. Brandon, you're on this one. And I was a lecturer at the Department of Urban and Regional Planning, and we ran students through a process to like create proof points. So like, what are all the billable services and a taro farm in the middle of an urban space? What are the services it's providing and start building people for? So Anthony DeLuz is in the middle. He has a 2.5 acre commercial license of a taro farm and urban space in Aiea. And this is the group that was supporting him. We ran our students through this process, and they came up with this. They spent like 3 months looking at it and looking at like these are all the inputs. This is the space where it happens, but these are all the outputs you can start to look at. And in the middle, it was like food for sales was the key focal point. We began to identify the services you're providing in native plant restoration and aquifer recharge, on flora and fauna habitat, for spaces for spiritual connection. These are all things that are really critical that there's an opportunity to kind of explore. Then afterwards, we use that space to work with them to think about how does he restructure his organization to meet these outcomes, as well as the landowner. How do they re-understand the value of these spaces so they can set up better ways to allow that to happen? So I'll close it where I'm at now. I'll run through this quickly, but now I'm at the Office of Indigenous Innovation, University. This is the general premise of the office. We sit at the intersect of three networks. The bottom network is our cultural and ecological traditional practices, the communities that still hold those practices. To the left is our network of researchers, people who work in the university, who are indigenous or equally important indigenous allied, that are really like down to work with community and to see these practices as sciences. And then the third is the network of the emerging and growing network of indigenous innovation spaces. And there's a lot of really emerging projects that are coming out of that. Like OII sits in the middle of it. We hope to have regional students enter into this space to come into that intersect of those three networks. And some of the outputs is that, how will this then help us with degree attainment, graduation rate, novel research that's co-owned by community, really pushing at this notion, like what are the jobs and spaces of employment that can come from this type of really innovative approach to understanding the value of ancestral practices. But then how do we look at indigenous practice and start to move indigenous out of it? It just becomes normalized. This is a really important way things were run. How do we do it again? But how do we make sure that communities at the table, that we're not just co-opting their knowledge from them in the process, but this co-designing is critical to it. And that's the framework I use. So the central theme of the office is the peba. The peba is that butterfly-shaped wedge. If you've ever done woodworking, it was critical when you had a space that was fractured. This was the thing by which you held the sides together. And I don't talk about metaphors for things I haven't done. I've made a peba. It's super hard. And I thought about that. Like, when coming to the university, what are some of the principles I think I want to make sure protect me in the work? And the first thing I would start with is like, how do we heal the fractures we see between a community and the university? What are the ways that we can really go past a performative approach of sorry to something that's way more meaningful? So I think the first part of this framework is equity. It's like when you have to fix something that's broken like this, the first thing you have to understand was, before you fix it, what was it used for? And have conversations about, like, we don't want to just fix Hawaiian culture, but we want to understand its purpose and how was it used, to value it as intrinsically. And then the second part of this is talk about who broke it. What happened? Who's the person that broke this? Let's have a real conversation. Let's not rush to the intervention, because that's a vital part of any restorative action. Otherwise, you may do it again. And also understanding, did it break because the wood was rotten, or did it break because it was misused? But then the next part of that is, once you've established and you started those conversations, then how do you fix it? What is the reciprocity? And that's the willingness to invest in community organizations that are actually holding the space. It asks the university, like, this doesn't live for me in PR, it lives in budgets, and it lives when people are invited to the conversation. But on the community side, it also has its own thing. Like, how do you set your organization up to be invested in? Like, how do you think about your work? Like, how do you have to change too? It asks both sides to stitch a crack together, so they have to be equally strong. And the last part of it is that it's transparent. And I believe that you would only put a peba on something you meant to be handed off to the next generation. Like, it shows people that this is a beloved thing, that people took the time to fix it. And it adds value to something that has a peba is actually presents itself better than something that doesn't. It adds like the wabi-sabi. It's very much something that adds, it's an indicator that this is a beautiful thing and people have taken the time to fix it. So the next generation break it, they can fix it too, because they know it has to be fixed. I'm tired. I think it's a little bit more, I'll skip through these parts, but I just maybe will kind of give an example of a project that we're working on. So one of the key things we're working on in OII is the Center for Indigenous Innovation and Equity. The Mauli Ola study that we talked about, Dr. Mauna Kea, we're able to create a national center within the Office of Minority Health to see if we can replicate the study across Hawaiian practitioners across the Pacific, as well as Native practitioners on the continent and in Alaska, to help look at Indigenous practices that are being held as a potential for being a health intervention. So we're working in partnership with Oklahoma State University and Dr. Valerie Gruber-Jernigan. It's based off a project we started in Mānoa. It's a little bit out. We had $2 million invested into the preliminary startup. $1 million went to UH. We see some examples of this, like the Mauliola study. There's another example that Dr. Kiabe Hula looking at how hula is being studied as a way to address health issues. So there's a lot of like examples of it. This is our team. We're a representative of the communities that we're researching, which is super critical that we do. And we have some things that we've built into this. We're normalizing, like using Indigenous practice to create national centers. So before we started one of our partner organizations, the Edith Kanakaole Foundation, we took the entire staff. And this organization is known for holding on to traditional practices as sciences and holding this body of knowledge about hula practice, but in other spaces, to bring out readings and chants that our ancestors used to talk about health, to create the framework for how we're going to do our work. So we're accountable to our ancestors' understanding of health when we're working in a contemporary system. And we are doing a landscape analysis where we met with 50 organizations across Hawaii and the Pacific and asked them questions around their practice. What is, like, how are there things they see in their work that could be understood as a health intervention? What are some of the gaps they see, and what are some of the challenges they're thinking about, and are they doing research? This is one of the some of the findings that we have, and like who we spoke to, and this was the clustering. Through that, we're beginning to see people are looking at traditional aquaculture and agriculture as a space to look at traditional medicine, sewing and navigation and language. Some of the things that are being lifted up. And what we hope to do with this is to start a research incubator that we're gonna, from the information that we're gathering from community, to begin to bootstrap research in partnership with the community organization and a culturally centered researchers to start to see if they can replicate it at scale. And the other thing I think this is critical to all of it in working in this space, and this isn't just for center, but this is just in general for my office. It's really clear that we have to put the how will we know we're successful. Like, it's not just doing things, but what are the indicators? And the how will we know is that at the community level, investment is being driven into community organizations, operations. At the university level, research is co-designed with community and supports the idea of ancestral practice as a valid science. Not that we need to have it validated, but and also the community organization's ability to deploy it is being validated, and therefore it drives investment. And the last part at the governmental level and foundational level is re-understanding Indigenous communities as spaces of innovation and the practice that they have as a seat of an emergent way that we can look at the world. And then finally, we're a great F-score. And this is where are currently situated within Ancestral. We're helping with the seed funding. We're working with Jason, Lee, and Kari Noi to be looking at the potential of replicating the CreateX labs in communities so that we can actually have a bold thesis that ancestral practice is data science. And that if kids fish and hunt, they have the prerequisites to understand their landscapes as 2 data points about how they're caring for their fisheries or how they're caring for their mountains, and create an invitation for these young adults to enter into this space comfortable in their own skin. And sitting alongside all of you and listeners to kind of co-learn together, because I think that's what the PEVA asks of us eventually, is that we got to learn how to work together. So that's it. That our ancestors saw themselves as to live like as the body form. Our deities were the living body forms of our landscapes.
Cool.
So yeah, That was a lot. I talked myself dry. I hope that was somewhat, I know that was a fire hose. There was a lot of things all at once, but yeah, thank you for your attentiveness and your listening. I don't know when it's like, maybe just these questions.
Ask some questions, Mahalo.
Do you have any questions?
We'll move through some really thought-provoking.
Yeah, like Gwen was saying, that was pretty amazing. Yeah, there's a heck of a lot that came out of that. And I guess my big question is, so for one, it seems like, I guess the appropriate word would be social stewardship was huge to pre-contact culture, like the idea of like, not necessarily some like social ownership, like we don't own this, we don't own that. It's like we're caretakers of this and we're all kind of like responsible for all of it together. And it seems like a lot of that is now being combined with, I guess, technology and modern advances, and some maybe non-traditional things, like for example, mentioning growing non-native crops in kind of a native way. So I guess like, what do you see as like the way forward to kind of move this beyond maybe just isolated communities and maybe to the whole Hawaiian Islands? And are there like policy initiatives currently? Because it seems pretty amazing. It seems like it could be a huge, help for the islands.
Yeah, first, I think that the term we're using is kinship.
Kinship.
So like, it's not stewardship, it's kinship. Like when we understand kinship of the landscape, and that's kind of towards the biocentric kind of emerging species. And that helps me a lot. Yeah, and I think that's the whole point of this, is proof points.
Mm.
What are some of the proof points, and how is this, one of my mentors called this a gracious invitation to rigor and accountability. How are people invited, but how do we understand how we show up? Because it super cannot be done by indigenous communities alone, but it can't be done without us. And there's been a lot and like super messiness in the intervening time. But I think, innovation is such an important word, because culture is the one everyone will pay lip service to, but it's the first budget that will get cut. Innovation will be the last them they may not be as like, but it's the last thing, is going to be cut, right? Because that's seen as the lifeline to future viability for your teams and a pathway to economic prosperity and so forth. I don't know what that looks like. I think it looks like this. I think it is bound by certain principles and structures we have to abide by that I was trying to put out. But yeah, I think that's the beauty of universities. Like there's spaces for critical thought and application, especially in research, where I sit, which bridges university and industry. And I hope to be in the 5 years at EPSCoR as one of the places where we can think about that. That's not a cop-out answer, but I don't know. I'm hoping
it's a big question.
I'm hoping we can start to figure that out for sure, because there are policy implications. And I think what drives policy is weird. It's what drives policy overtly and behind doors. Right? Good policy sometimes never gets funded because of the engines of economic prosperity. So when you compare, like, this makes sense ecologically and economically and socially, then it gives us more leverage.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Good question.
So Kamuela, I was really interested when you were talking about observing the fishing practices and all the science that is embedded in those practices. Just looking at the type of nets and the technique of pulling the fish in and then not losing them out the top of the net. Yeah, is that is that an ancestral practice that's been passed down? Or because I've also seen videos and things of tossing the net as well as dropping it over the side.
Yeah, there are definitely organizations like Wai'anae and other spaces that networkers.
Networkers.
Yeah, so like they Yeah, funny.
Yeah.
But there are resilient communities across the state that are still holding on to that practice. That practice itself emanates from Miloli'i on South Kona, and the Miloli'i community still practicing local fishing. Quite often they're impacted by the desire to like develop spaces for luxury homes and so on. And being able to afford to live in your community to practice it is really hard.
Yeah.
But I think when we can show that as the ROI financially on maintaining a pelagic fishery and this ecological and social services versus another gated community, like that gives us short-term ROI. But when you think about long-term climate realities, all of those people are on the front line of understanding the changing of the ocean. And they can give you real-time data on that as well as feed you. And I think as a human species, it's really clear, like indigenous doesn't mean brown people. It means continuity. And that's what was taught to me by my mentor and Dr. Mānoa. So everyone's indigenous to someplace. And it's the state of humanity pre-industrialization. You had deep ties to landscape and community. And there are trade-offs because that can be junk too, and everyone's in your stuff all the time. So there is a reason why they embrace modernity. So I think of this as what's the calibration point. When you're in a space that still has indigenous people, you honor your indigeneity by you supporting their agency. And you learn about yours. You learn about like ask questions like how did my ancestors have a relationship? And I think ostensibly there's a lot of joy that can come from teaching about it, as well as practical application.
Thank you. What a wonderful presentation and so many great examples of things we can really learn from. One of the things that really struck me is this genealogy and kinship, which feels very localized. And I'm wondering how much sort of synthesis or communication there is. You have so much environmental heterogeneity that it's probably slightly, I mean, you know, it's slightly different places. And how do people communicate to sort of identify the similarities or the differences or the patterns?
Yeah, I think there's some really emergent work about linking indigenous communities and indigenous sciences and creating that space for that nomenclature and that kind of overview of what the dynamics are and they're sharing amongst themselves. It's an emergent, that whole biocultural restoration framework that's being promoted by the Biden administration, for example, are now beginning to see that value of that. I think it's moving from the performative capitulation to we did bad things to you, here's $10 million, shut up, to like, well, this is a really important science. And like, how do we, and you guys are super good at knocking people out and try to take your shit. So let's reestablish a different type of relationship with each other. I don't think it's anywhere near equitable in there yet, but I do think it's what has to happen. And I think there's a movement towards it, which I hope this office and this space can start to be a part of that, because that's critical of sharing of knowledge across genealogies. But I think the big part about all of this is also going to be data sovereignty, because not everyone has access to all knowledge base. And there's a lot of predatory forces that takes data and use it. So like, what is the establishment of the protocols of accessing knowledge was an ancestral prerogative. Like when we did our chants, there are certain parts of the chants that we only knew the code to if we knew the secret, like the underlying parts of it, otherwise just sort of surface level language. That was baked into ancestral knowledge sharing too. So I think it's that sharing, but also understanding how you defend and community own their data, but then think about what does it mean for them to use it that benefits others, but they still have, they keep control of the secret parts of it, because it's their IP. And you protect someone's IP from another space, you sure as heck better protect IP from indigenous communities. It's not a free for all. So I think that's some of the parts I think a lot of them.
Got one more for you.
Yeah.
What would you say is the biggest obstacle right now to re-empowering indigenous native communities here in the Hawaiian Islands?
Good question. And it depends on who you ask, because we're not heterogeneous.
Right.
It's a grad school where I've read lots of group of people. From my perspective, I think it's barriers, but providing why I show up is how do we provide operational funding to these organizations? Like I sat on my dad's board for a long time and always watching them shuck and drive to get programmatic funding and having to reinvent themselves to really fickle funders. But when you provide hard data of the validity of their work, then you can provide them sustained funding. Because I think they know what to do. I think being able to keep the lights on and the programs funded, we reach the critical mass of support. That's kind of the one that keeps things. And that's where I think research and university can really help. Is to affirm the validity of it and to support their next generation. If we Hawaiians can't afford to live in Hawaii, all of this is moot. So like what are ways that we're allowing our youth to participate in this space so they can build a future for themselves is like the key barrier. But I think there's a lot of inroads being made. So I'm super not signing up for a story of sadness and loss anymore. I'm over that. I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think there's some really good opportunity. Sure.
I don't know exactly how to ask this question yet. So formulated. So you're part of the Office of Facilities Office, right?
Yeah.
Innovation.
Yeah.
And big part of the responsibility there is on issues of IP, intellectual property. How do you perceive helping like students, for example, or the community navigate this notion, this challenging issue of indigenous IP, data sovereignty? Like, many students for scientists here are going to gather data from the community. They're going to work with the community and gain knowledge as a result of working with them. What is the way to navigate this?
In this call, Katie Hinson and Rosie Allegado have been doing a lot of that, and they are actually going to be helping. They have Mānoa, which is a process by which they work as indigenous and indigenous allied researchers to tackle that. There are resources for sure. And I think they will be helping this process and creating this space to discuss it. I super don't want to mansplain what they do. and act like I know what that process is in its entirety, but there are resources and there's a growing body of work about it. Another thing I can offer is spaces like this to talk about indigeneity, not as a cool thing that's a free for all to get from, but the genealogical heritage of people. And that just like you wouldn't go into someone's house and take something from their drawer that you think is super cool, you just wouldn't take an indigenous practice and try to create a technology out of it. More of it should piss you off that you want to back anybody who feel that's happening to them and leverage your privilege and standing in society to be in defense of that, not just because it feels good, but that's like their own, and even property is where, because Hawaiian have a different understanding of relationship. With things that are really property, they're kins, that we had that kind of space. So I feel this is another emerging space where many people can think about it. The last thing I say, I'm part of a project with the Purple Maya Foundation called Kamaka Inana, which runs people, you can actually sign up for it. It's done twice a year. It's a 9-week course on teaching the basics of indigenous design, where we go through a practice and you can understand what are the principles and come up with it. So like, for me, that people Hawaiian ancestry know about data sovereignty is critical, is almost equally more critical than non-Hawaiians understand the principles of data sovereignty and support it. And just like you wouldn't steal someone else's stuff, right? Like, it should be fundamental, but I think there's been a positioning of indigenous knowledge as everyone has access to it. And it's this mystical thing that you can do this, create your own practice around. You wouldn't do that, like you wouldn't call yourself a biomedical researcher just because you watch the biomedical YouTube video. Right? So there's rigor attached to it that I hope this can be part of the conversation. Is that a good answer, Jason?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I don't know what's the other part of it too, but I'm willing to find out.
So I'm sorry, not Kamu, I was just thinking about asking a question about Mānoa farms. I was impressed with, so the program, the students go through the program and then they go back to school, or are they in
Oh,
school?
no, all of those students are all UH students.
So they're all in school?
Monday, Wednesday, Friday, they're on the farm. Tuesdays and Thursdays, they're in college.
So 3 days a week, they're on the farm.
And 2 days, they're in college.
You know, I was impressed. I mean, that's hard work, hard physical work. What do you?
Chloe was working full-time on the farm and catching a bus 2 hours each way to come to UH Manoa, and she got her degree full-time college student.
So my question is, do you think there's a relationship between, you know, that kind of really hard physical work where, you know, you really, actually it gives you time to think about stuff, that kind of work. Do you think there's a correlation between that and the success of the program?
Absolutely. And that's why when we, part of it is the notion of kinship. Like they understand, Chloe understands the ancestral relationship she has to that land and to her peers. And that drives this deep seated. In other spaces, that kind of energy would manifest itself in violence. But in this space, we're providing opportunity to reclaim agency, not through violence, but through food. And like also growing our own capacity to make executive decisions. Like there's an Office of Indigenous Innovation within the University where it becomes as well. Because we're able to work hard and show these metrics. And I'm not sitting outside of, I'm sitting within the executive office of the university.
Yeah.
Not good for you.
Well, and so also, I'm just a little bit familiar with Alika's project on the microbiome. So the students take the food home, take some come, yeah.
So the way it works is that the way we run the farm, and they have to learn every single aspect of the farm and learn every single aspect of going to college in their first year. So they show up knowing in the first year, teaching them every aspect of the farm, from planting to soil management to irrigation. And then we've also created we've created classes at community college and at the baccalaureate degree that teaches the fundamentals of soil science, business, and so forth. They're not expected to become farmers, but they learn about the different aspects of caring for soil, caring for food, which I think will be the new lawyer, and choose what profession they want to go in after their associates. So yeah, I think a lot of it is they're all in the first year you're expected to learn how to run the farm and go to college. The second year you manage a team of 5 of your groups. And then you teach them how to run the farm and teach them how to go to college. And you graduate with your associates. So when you go into the baccalaureate, your AA you have an AA, but you also have real-time managerial skill. You learn the fundamentals of business, you learn the fundamentals of farming. You also learn the chants, you know, the names of your God. You learn the fundamentals of how their ancestors cared for this.
Yeah. I mean, it's really quite unique, the whole management part, because when do you ever get to learn that, unless you're in that kind of a program? When do you get that kind of?
That's how the valley was managed 1777 and before. That's how our ancestors taught. You taught, you couldn't separate what was your family member from who was your teacher, from who was your farmer. That we taught holistically. And then there's built-in stuff to the farm now where they focus on, there's a social work around the farm, on social and emotional well-being, teaching the fundamentals of emotional intelligence. They actually at the farm created a farm GPA. They measure to the school GPA.
That's great.
And that the pay scale you get is an aggregate of your farm school. You get your basic $500 stipend, but you have opportunities to earn more money if you want to. And your earning is the aggregate farm school GPA. And the farm GPA is given to you by your peers. And it focuses on how you do on the farm, how you do in a packing shed, what's your growth, your leadership, and like your ability to model emotional, your EQ is also focused. So they're not farmers, right? They're like more of an ancestral understanding of what caring for that look like. And then we would like another part how they get them and they're not, but part of what was super badass was I really missed was that if the whole internship cohort, because we have them we only hire once a year, which is a crazy business model. They come in as a cohort. If they get an aggregate above a 3.0, we would take them to town restaurant at Kenny if they ever go to town restaurant. because he would buy our product and we'd shut down the restaurant and there'd be an 8-course meal that all these interns would eat, all of their food. So they would see their stuff plated. Like they go to the farmers market and they have to be entrepreneur and sell stuff. So they gotta eat the things that they grow in. So we teach them how to cook it. And therefore they develop a relationship with the food. We super weren't designed to be a health intervention. The health intervention was a byproduct of restoring what it started. The starting premise, the restoring those practices. And where we're going to is now studying the soil health to show how our ancestral practices can sequester carbon, can restore the biotic life of soil. To really show like this deep dive with hard data. But I'm talking to it. I'm putting you aside.
I'm going to ask a really silly question. Do the kids who come out of that program enjoy eating more vegetables?
Yeah,
you would think, right?
They do. Oh, they people dog kale like kale is action.
Actually, kale's pretty good.
You kale, you put like kale, fine salt, olive oil, you put it up, and then you put. It's a really good carb replacement.
It's really good in pizza.
Yeah, so it's actually super good food, and I think part of what the other point is food they grow. Like they do that. They know how hard it is to grow it. They know how to harvest it, to wash it. When they not only they eat it, their families eat it because they can take home, right? So they've actually in that Mauleola study, they deepen the network. So if you live with a Mau intern, you're 25% less likely to develop type 2 diabetes. So they began to show a lot like the network impact that you're having, which is describing a cultural dynamic. You're going to bring the food home and you're going to feed your family and they're going to eat them.
Right.
They're also teaching their peers how to go to college, negotiate with scholarships, and they're teaching them how to show up for work. Like you can't be late 3 days in a row, get your shit together. Like they're teaching, so they become the agents of change.
Yeah. Wow, very cool. All right, any last questions? Anybody online? Olivia, Maria, anyone want to ask a question before we're still making them keep talking. So good at it. Olivia, any questions, or Maria that you wanted to ask Kamu?
I think someone asked my question, but I just wanted to say thank you so much, Kamu, for your time. This was really great to learn a little bit more about, all the work that you've been involved in, and just really good to see, that there are resources in the community to build that connection. I think it's a wonderful thing.
Thank you. I appreciate all your leadership in this space too. Yeah, I'll be here for 5 years, at the very least.
Yeah, this is your first. You have more chances to ask more questions. In fact, we'll do updates, certainly with this group on all the stuff that we're working on. All right. Okay, thank you so much, Kamu. This was just awesome. Great way to end the week and head off into our.
Thank you all. Simple and Gwen has it is KENOS at Hawaii.edu. If you have any questions that you can try bad boundaries, I would like to talk about it. And like I love spaces of learning and people that are really interested in things, and I aspire to them. So mahalo Gwen and thank you, Jason, for allowing us to have a lab. Mahalo so much for sitting. Okay.